You know, when you look at a massive, heavy iron bank vault, your brain kind of immediately makes this subconscious calculation.
Oh, absolutely. You see the spinning combination lock and the thick steel door?
Right, the intricate bolts. And you just automatically assume that whatever's inside that vault must be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's basically a visual shortcut for trust. We rarely actually question the value of the contents.
Exactly. We're too busy marveling at the formidable protection guarding them, you know. But what if the ultimate security system isn't designed to keep thieves out, but rather, like, to keep the truth locked in?
Well, that's exactly what today's source material completely upends. We are taking a deep dive into the unbelievable true story of Great Thérèse.
Yes, Thérèse Humbert.
She was this 19th century French laundress who orchestrated a 25-year, 120 million franc scam.
Which is just a staggering amount of money, especially back then.
It really is. And our sources for this deep dive are a collection of historical articles and legal records that detail her whole deception.
And it's just such a phenomenal historical case study, right? Because it features everything. I mean, we're talking fake American millionaires, high-stakes courtroom drama.
And a justice system that was utterly compromised by its own embarrassment. She basically became the first woman to build a massive financial pyramid scheme in France.
And it all centers around this locked safe that held the French elite hostage for decades. A safe that started and honestly ended with a single literal brick.
A literal brick. Yeah, to understand the mechanics of how Great Thérèse pulled this off, we really have to look at where she got the inspiration.
Right, her origins. So she was born Thérèse d'Aurignac in 1854 near Toulouse to a peasant family.
And her father was an alcoholic, but he was an alcoholic with a very specific, very loud delusion.
Yeah, he constantly bragged to the entire village that he had these noble roots.
Yeah.
And to prove it, he kept a sealed, heavy chest in their modest home.
Which he swore held the deeds to this vast, luxurious estate in the Auvergne region.
And for the d'Aurignac family, that physical chest was like a psychological beacon.
Exactly. I mean, they lived in grinding poverty, but the mere presence of that locked box promised a future of inevitable wealth.
It totally dictated how the family viewed themselves and how they interacted with their neighbors, you know.
Yeah.
The father used the mystery of the box to command just a tiny shred of local respect.
But then, you know, the father dies in 1874, and the family gathers around. The moment of truth has finally arrived.
They finally crack open this legendary sealed chest, expecting deeds, maybe some heirloom jewelry, and what is inside?
A single ordinary brick.
Just a brick. It was a complete fabrication. Now, I mean, most people will look at that brick and be entirely crushed by the betrayal, but Thérèse, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's.
Thérèse seems to have treated that brick like a masterclass in human psychology.
She really did.
She realized that as long as the box remains closed, people will bend over backwards to believe whatever you tell them is inside it.
And what's fascinating here is the leap she makes from local delusion to, like, an actionable strategy. She recognizes that the illusion of wealth, properly shielded from scrutiny, is actually more powerful than actual wealth.
Because with real money, there are limits.
Exactly. With imagined money locked in a box, the potential is infinite. So she becomes the practical head of the family, moves them to Toulouse, and gets a job as a laundress.
But she doesn't just wash clothes for anyone. She strategically places herself in the household of Gustave Humbert.
Who is a very big deal.
Oh, massive. Gustave is a prominent lawyer, a law professor, a mayor, a senator, and he is on the fast track to becoming France's Minister of Justice.
And Thérèse zeroes in on his son, Frederick, who the sources describe as this sort of scattered, romantic, tousle-haired law student.
But the societal gap here in the late 19th century is massive, right? The Humbert family represents the established, educated elite of the French Third Republic.
While Thérèse is a peasant, naturally, Gustave is vehemently opposed to his son marrying a laundress. I mean, it threatens the family's social capital.
So Thérèse realizes she needs to upgrade her social standing. She moves to Paris, takes a few nursing courses, and somehow procures a noble diploma.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and wondering how you just, get a noble diploma.
Right, like you just pick it up at the store.
You really have to understand the chaotic bureaucracy of the time. Records were easily forged or bought if you knew the right clerks.
But the title alone isn't enough for the Humberts. So she drops the lie that literally changes European financial history.
This is where it gets crazy.
She claims that while working as a nurse, she cared for an incredibly wealthy, dying Chicago millionaire named Robert Henry Crawford.
And because she was so kind to him in his final days, he supposedly left her his entire fortune, $100 million dollars in his will.
But she adds a brilliant condition.
Right, she tells them the will explicitly states that the fortune cannot be executed and the capital cannot be touched until her younger sister Marie turns 21.
It's like the 19th century version of fake it till you make it, except her collateral is literally an imaginary friend with a ticking clock.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But I have to push back on the sources here. How did a high society family, spearheaded by a brilliant legal mind like Gustav Humbert, just blindly accept this laundress-turned-heiress without demanding to see a bank statement or, I don't know, contacting an American attorney? It feels completely absurd.
Well, we have to look at the mechanics of willful blindness within elite circles. Gustav Humbert wasn't an idiot, he was a highly ambitious politician.
Okay, so he had motives.
Exactly. By tying the payout to her sister's age, Thérèse provided a legally plausible excuse for why the money wasn't physically present.
Yeah, that buys her time.
And more importantly, Gustav's own political campaigns and lifestyle were becoming increasingly expensive.
So when Thérèse and Frederick married, she leveraged the Humbert name to secure massive lines of credit from Parisian banks.
Precisely. Gustav likely suspected something was off, but because his political rise was being actively funded by the very credit Thérèse was securing, he chose not to look inside the metaphorical box.
Wow. So the banks are looking at this couple, the son of a powerful senator and a woman who holds a documented conditional claim to $100 million, and they just start handing over fortunes.
Yeah, the couple moves into a lavish Paris hotel. They dine at the best restaurants. They're buying up art.
And they are functioning entirely on promissory notes and letters of credit, all backed by the anticipation of the Crawford millions.
And Gustav even rides this wave of newfound, seemingly bottomless family prestige all the way to becoming the Minister of Justice in 1882.
That is wild.
Well, the societal mechanics of the Belle Epoque relied heavily on the word of honor among gentlemen.
Right.
If the Minister of Justice treats his daughter-in-law as a multimillionaire heiress, no Parisian banker is going to risk offending him by demanding to see the raw American bonds.
Because to question her wealth was to insult the Minister of Justice himself. But, there's a mathematical reality to living on credit. The clock is ticking on her sister's 21st birthday. Lenders are eventually going to want their principal back, not just the interest.
And right on cue, a highly skeptical state bank notary named Monsieur Leone decides to break the social etiquette.
As a notary, his entire job is to verify the physical existence of assets. He demands to physically see the American bonds backing their massive loans, or he is going to sue them and let the courts audit the estate.
So Thérèse is suddenly backed into a corner. An audit would instantly vaporize her entire life. She needs a distraction so massive that it paralyzes the legal system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Before the notary can even file his lawsuit to audit her, two nephews of the late American millionaire Mr. Crawford suddenly materialize in Paris out of nowhere.
Just out of thin air.
And they produce a rival will. They claim the inheritance should actually be divided, and they contest Thérèse's claim to the full $100 million.
The brilliance of this move cannot be overstated. By introducing the nephews, she doesn't just create a distraction, she initiates a ferocious legal battle that fundamentally shifts the jurisdiction of the money.
And this legal war doesn't just last a few months. It lasts for a quarter of a century.
25 years of litigation.
The courts get involved, and they rule that because this staggering inheritance is now disputed between Thérèse and the Crawford nephews, nobody can touch it.
Right. The court officially orders the mysterious Crawford bonds to be locked away in a neutral third-party safe until the trial concludes.
And whose safe do they choose? The personal safe of the Minister of Justice himself, Gustav Humbert, her own father-in-law.
She weaponized civil litigation to build an impenetrable fortress around a lie.
But what I don't understand is the legal tolerance for this kind of delay. The trial drags on for 25 years because these Crawford nephews are constantly, supposedly traveling to the most inaccessible places on Earth to gather evidence.
Right. The courts are looking for them in the jungles of the Amazon, the deserts of Australia.
If someone sues me today and skips court for 2 decades, a judge dismisses the case. But here is the twist from the sources. The nephews didn't exist either. They were Thérèse's own brothers, Romain and Émile d'Aurignac, wearing fake mustaches and changing their accents.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a profound truth about institutional complicity. Litigation paradoxically validates a lie.
How so?
By creating a highly publicized, complex legal dispute over the money, Thérèse completely changed the conversation in the financial sector. The banks and the court stopped asking, does this money actually exist? And instead spent 25 years arguing who rightfully owns this money.
Oh my gosh, it's like Schrodinger's fortune. As long as the safe stays locked by court order, the money is simultaneously real and fake, and the banks get to keep counting those anticipated millions on their balance sheets.
Exactly. The lawsuit itself became the definitive proof of the inheritance. After all, the logic goes, why would two men spend decades fighting tooth and nail for a fortune if it wasn't real?
Right. And because the safe holding the supposedly disputed bonds was sealed by the state, housed by the Minister of Justice, no private bank or angry notary had the authority to demand an audit.
The seal of the French government was literally protecting the empty box. Over 2 decades, they managed to rack up loans totaling roughly 120 million francs.
They bought castles, massive Parisian real estate, and influenced national politics.
But as you said earlier, we hit that mathematical ceiling again. You can't just live on massive bank loans indefinitely.
Because the debt service, the interest payments on 120 million francs, requires immense constant cash flow. The bank loans weren't enough to sustain the daily illusion of aristocracy.
So she had to fundamentally change her business model, from borrowing from the elite to soliciting from the masses. She realizes she's exhausted the patience of the institutional lenders.
So what does she do?
In 1893, Thérèse evolves from a clever society fraudster into the first female builder of a retail financial pyramid scheme in France. She opens a company called Rente Viagère, which translates to life annuity.
She essentially ran a 19th century GoFundMe, but instead of a charitable cause, she was funding her own real estate empire.
That's exactly what it was. And the visual, the sources paint here is just striking.
Yeah, she is living in actual castles, hosting royalty. But when she goes to work at the Rente Viagère office, she stands at the counter wearing a very modest, dark, unpretentious dress.
She has these little knitted mitts on her plump hands, nervously drumming on the desk as she talks to everyday French citizens. Shopkeepers, teachers, pensioners.
And the wardrobe choice is highly calculated.
Oh, completely. She is performing the role of the conservative, responsible steward of capital. If she showed up covered in diamonds, the middle-class depositors might suspect she was spending their money. By dressing modestly, she projects financial prudence.
And she promises these citizens a massive 15% annual return on their investments. At the time, standard legitimate French banks were offering maybe 2 or 3%.
And mechanically, a 15% guaranteed return is entirely unsustainable unless you are generating unbelievable commercial profits, which she wasn't. There was no investment portfolio. The money went absolutely nowhere.
She just took the new deposits coming in from the public, used them to pay the 15% interest to the old depositors, and skimmed the massive remainder to pay her bank loans and fund her lavish lifestyle.
It's a textbook pyramid scheme.
But again, the question is, how does the government not audit a rogue financial institution offering 15% returns?
Well, she was protected by the shield of respectability. The ongoing, highly publicized court case over the Crawford millions acted as a legal injunction against common sense.
And her deep political ties, right? Her husband was now a member of parliament.
Exactly. That meant that any government auditor who dared to investigate her life annuity company risked destroying their own career. The fraud was structurally protected by the state.
But all pyramids eventually run out of new bricks. By 1902, the math finally catches up with her.
You just don't have enough new middle-class deposits to cover the massive withdrawal.
Right. A depositor demands a large sum back. Thérèse plays her usual well-worn card. I'm so sorry, I have no free liquid funds right now because my $100 million is still tied up in that annoying Crawford court case.
But this time, a very sharp prosecutor named Pierre Waldeck-Rousseau decides he's had enough. He finally asks the unthinkable out loud in a legal setting. Does the Crawford inheritance even exist?
It was the incredibly simple question that the entire Parisian financial and political elite had been too polite or maybe too deeply compromised to ask for decades.
So the court finally agrees to call the bluff. They order Gustave Humbert's legendary safe core. Gustave had passed away a few years prior, but the safe remained. They order it to be officially opened on May 7, 1902.
And when the authorities arrive at the Humbert mansion that morning, the place is completely deserted.
They're gone.
The Humberts has vanished into thin air. And they haven't just left, they have stripped the mansion of all its easily pawnable assets. The tapestries, the small art, the luxury goods, they're all gone.
But they couldn't take the massive iron safe.
Exactly. The authorities bring in a locksmith. The entire country, I mean bankers, politicians, and thousands of middle-class investors, is holding its breath for the 100 million in American bonds.
The door swings open.
And inside, they find no bonds. They find a stack of worthless old newspapers and a single, solitary brick.
It's wild. The brick is such a profound, almost literary symbol. It represents the generational transmission of a delusion. Her father used a brick in a locked box to fool a tiny peasant village, and Thérèse took that exact same psychological mechanism and scaled it up to bankrupt half of France.
It is absolute poetic irony. And shortly after the safe is opened, U.S. authorities finally do some basic digging in Chicago, something nobody bothered to do for 25 years, and confirm that a millionaire named Robert Henry Crawford never even existed.
So the Humberts are totally off the grid. The authorities are searching everywhere, looking as far as Odessa in Russia.
But they are eventually caught in Madrid, Spain, entirely by chance. And the way they get caught, it's like a Hollywood heist movie in reverse.
Oh, it really is.
They broke out of the vault and left the brick behind, but they couldn't handle the anonymity. A neighbor in Madrid noticed that this quiet new family was subscribing to an unusually large number of daily French newspapers. Thérèse and her family literally got caught because they couldn't stop doom-scrolling their own bad press over their morning coffee.
It speaks to the narcissism required to pull off a fraud of this magnitude. They were utterly addicted to the narrative they had created. Even as their empire collapsed and they were fleeing for their lives, their primary concern was reading what the Parisian elite were saying about them.
So the gang is captured in Madrid and dragged back to Paris. Now, you would expect a massive, highly punitive reckoning, right? They ruined thousands of middle-class lives and made a mockery of the state.
The trial begins on August 8th, 1903. But the outcome reveals something far more embarrassing about the financial system itself than it does about the Humberts.
Yeah, this is where the story shifts from a tale of a clever con artist to a glaring indictment of institutional pride and self-preservation. In a shocking twist at the trial, the elite banks, the institutions that lent her the bulk of that 120 million francs, quietly dropped their claims.
They just stepped back.
They realized they had been duped using their own institutional capital, and they decided they absolutely did not want the horrible public relations disaster of airing that level of gullibility in an open court. So what does this all mean? The bankers were literally more afraid of looking stupid to their shareholders than they were angry about losing millions.
This raises an important question about the complicity of the elite. The justice system and the financial sector essentially colluded to sweep their own catastrophic failure under the rug.
Wow.
The fraud had grown so massive and had entangled so many powerful politicians and bankers that the victims actually felt compelled to protect the perpetrator in order to protect the perceived integrity of their own institutions.
Because if the public realized how easily the banks were fooled, it could have triggered a nationwide bank run.
Exactly. And the defense lawyers for the Humberts recognized this desperation. They argued a brilliant, almost dizzying legal paradox.
They stood up in court and said, "Your Honor, how can you convict my clients of forging documents for an inheritance that never actually existed in the first place?"
It is a phenomenal piece of sophistry, but it worked perfectly in a courtroom that was politically desperate to make the whole scandal quietly disappear.
Because of that institutional embarrassment, the sentences handed down were incredibly, shockingly light. Thérèse and Frédéric got just 5 years in prison. Her brother Romain got 3 years, and Émile and sister Marie got only 2 years.
And even then, they secured early releases.
After they got out, the family emigrated to the United States. In the final perfect ironic twist, they settled in Chicago, the exact fictional hometown of her imaginary benefactor, Mr. Crawford.
You can't make it up.
Thérèse lived out her days there in relative obscurity and died in 1918 at the age of 64.
She faced almost no proportional consequence for orchestrating one of the greatest financial frauds in European history. She understood that if you steal a little, you go to jail. But if you steal enough and implicate enough powerful people in your lie, the system will protect you to protect itself.
To recap the journey of great Thérèse, we watched her take a peasant's brick and a childhood lesson in deception and spin it into a 120 million franc empire. She weaponized the illusion of conditional wealth.
She turned the French legal system into her own personal PR firm by staging a fake 25-year lawsuit against her own brothers.
And she bent the most powerful men of her era to her will simply by giving them a locked box they were too greedy and ultimately too proud to question.
The core takeaway for you listening today is that the fundamental mechanics of fraud haven't changed in over a century. The financial instruments are more complex, the technology moves at the speed of light, but human psychology remains entirely static.
We are still deeply vulnerable to the proximity of power, the allure of exclusive names, and the irresistible, irrational promise of impossibly high returns.
The human ego is always the real vulnerability in any security system.
Which brings us right back to that imposing iron vault we talked about at the beginning. The greatest banks of 1903 dropped their lawsuits simply because they were too profoundly embarrassed to admit to the world they had been fooled by a locked box with a brick inside. If a massive financial fraud relies just as much on the victim's pride and willful blindness as it does on the con artist's lies, you have to wonder, how many modern economic institutions, how many tech startups or massive hedge funds are just guarding empty safes today simply because society is too embarrassed to ask to look inside?